Hey guys, so now that Natlan is coming to a close with the Not Quite trailer coming out, I wanted to take a closer look into the history of how the fanbase perceived Natlan, specifically a controversial topic that has clouded the community. That topic obviously being the modern yet tribal aesthetics of Natlan. Some people hate it, some people like it, but me personally, I really enjoyed it. Regardless, this video isn't about my opinion. This video is about whether the Genshin developers actually implemented these two contrasting aesthetics successfully or not. For the layout of this video, I'll be doing an introduction, which is this. Then I'll be going over the critiques that the community has given over the implementation of these contrasting aesthetics. Then afterwards, I'll give a quick recap, and then for the end, I'll give the ultimate answer to whether Natlan's implementation of its modern theme was actually done right. Before going over these critiques, I'd like to give some context and explain the overarching themes that we see in Natlan's plots, lore, and aesthetics. Throughout Natlan, we see that war has been a major theme of Natlan for 500 years, since they've been at constant war with the Abyss, so much so that their nation has been branded as the Nation of War. We also see that the people of Natlan honor and appreciate their ancestors, more specifically their heroes, which can be seen through the ancient names that some people of Natlan are given from the Wayob, which expresses a theme of acknowledgement and appreciation of the dead. The people of Natlan have also developed close connections with their Saurians over time, to the point to where they value other Saurians as humans, which expresses the theme of ethical relationships with animals. So, with those main themes acting as context, the main critiques that I noticed were being spread around the internet throughout the entirety of Natlan were: why don't NPCs also have futuristic technology? Why doesn't the environment have it? Why do only playable characters have it? Why does only Xilonen know how to make it? And modern aesthetics just don't fit in Genshin Impact. Well, to start off with the first critique, I'm actually going to cover the second critique as well, since I believe that these critiques are pretty much one and the same, since they're so interwoven. This is because the reasons for why the environment doesn't have any futuristic technology is also because the NPCs don't have any futuristic technology. With Fontaine, there are many instances of steampunk industrial-like machinery, since pretty much every enemy is a mech. This is because a major aesthetic of Fontaine is based off of France, which had an industrial revolution during the 19th century, which is what inspired the steampunk aesthetic. But in Natlan, not that many NPCs use futuristic technology, which is why the environment doesn't have any futuristic industrial-like machinery like in Fontaine. Another explanation for why the NPCs, and thus the environment, doesn't have any futuristic components is because a major theme of Natlan is that they don't want to harm the Saurians, which they value as other human beings. This theme and almost a dilemma can clearly be seen in Chaska's story quest, in where some Natlanese people were trying to create futuristic technology in the form of jetpacks that only work when Saurians were exploited, which I believe clearly conveys the theme that the people of Natlan would rather preserve the bonds they have with the Saurians than to obtain futuristic-like technology, which, if they were to obtain futuristic technology rather than to preserve the bonds with the Saurians, it would without a doubt come at the cost of the environment, and thus their relationships with the Saurians, since it wouldn't make sense for a highly futuristic and industrial-like environment to be able to hold deep and ethical relationships with animals like the ones that we see in Natlan. If we simply look at the relationships between real humans and animals, we can clearly see that countless ecosystems are destroyed simply because us highly advanced humans want to build infrastructures in nature, since we prioritize technology rather than deep relationships with nature. Not only that, but even though this hasn't been fully confirmed, at least not to my knowledge, Saurians are pretty likely to be made out of phlogiston, since the Vishaps, who are descendants of dragons, are made out of elemental energy, which, as we know, is phlogiston, and phlogiston is also the primordial energy of the life realm, which was said to have created the original dragons. Not only that, but with the Fatui capturing Saurians and holding them in cages, it only leads me to think that they'd be exploiting their phlogiston in the same way that the people in Chaska's story were trying to do with the jetpacks, which is highly likely considering that the Fatui don't have a deep connection with Natlan and thus the Saurians, which also leads me to assume that the people in Chaska's story quest really didn't have any other option. They had to either exploit the Saurians for the jetpacks, or they had to protect the Saurians that they value as much as human beings. So, with these assumptions that I consider to be fairly logical in mind, to have a highly advanced society that expends this phlogiston, which they will since devices that use phlogiston expend phlogiston, that would mean that society would inevitably lead to the droughts of phlogiston, and thus the need for exploitation of Saurians, which again, the people of Natlan wouldn't want to do, since a major theme of Natlan is that they value them as other humans. But these reasons could be argued to just be lore reasons, which could also be argued aren't even true since I did take a couple of assumptions. But I feel like had I not, that definitely would have shown how dead my media literacy would have been. Anyways, the point I'm trying to make is that everyone knows that the developers could have added whatever lore reason for why some things aren't present in game or even possible, like the fact that you're not able to use Saurians or Phlogiston outside of Natlan, which is kinda dumb since Saurians are confirmed to be able to go outside of Natlan after the war. But anyways, what is truly the reason for why the devs didn't want to turn Natlan into a modern nation? Since the playable characters look modern and have futuristic technology, I think they didn't want to turn Natlan into a modern nation simply because they didn't want to. Turning all of Natlan into a cyberpunk-esque city would have ruined the beauty behind the contrast of the tribal and modern aesthetics in Natlan, which I believe ties right back into the critique of why do only playable characters have futuristic tech. I believe that the reason for why playable characters have futuristic tech while the environment has tribal and modern looking aesthetics is also the answer for why the devs wanted to have completely contrasting aesthetics in Natlan. MiHoYo has a motorcycle, Kenichi an 8-bit projection, Xilonen a floating DJ set with roller skates, Kachina has a drill, Chaska a flying gun, and Aoife has a pistol, because all of these characters are modern humans, at least relative to the history of Natlan. The developers gave these characters futuristic technology with a modern aesthetic to create the emphasis that the Natlanese people that we know of are all modern humans, which is used to emphasize the history of Natlan, which is a major component of Natlan's main themes, since the major themes of Natlan are that Natlan has been at war for 500 years and the Natlanese people respect their heritage. So it would only make sense for the developers to emphasize the components of history by making it so that the current people of Natlan all look modern relative to their ancestors. Not to mention that a major theme in the plot is that their history of war is now coming to an end. So it would only make sense to emphasize that the characters that we see in Natlan right now are meant to be the last characters in Natlan's history of war, aka futuristic or modern compared to the first Natlanese people 500 years ago. And what better way to emphasize this than to give them not only modern aesthetics but also futuristic technology, aka not just a gun but a flying gun, and not just a motorcycle but a flying motorcycle. In short, the developers chose to implement a modern aesthetic onto playable Natlan characters by giving them modern designs with futuristic technology to emphasize that they are modern humans, so that they can emphasize the history components in the majority of Natlan's major themes. This conscious decision by the developers to emphasize this modernity of the current Natlan can obviously be seen in MiHoYo's story quest, where Xbalanque gets revived for a day and repeatedly states how modern the new Natlan looks, since the last time he saw it was 2000 years ago, which clearly conveys that the new Natlan is meant to feel modern, which was obviously done to emphasize the history of Natlan's nation, since again it's a major component in its themes. Now some people could still make the rhetoric that these reasons just don't cut it, since they are still lore related, but in my opinion, just because these themes are lore related, it doesn't mean that these reasons weren't locked behind some restrictions of lore. The developers could have always rewritten Natlan to be something else, but they didn't, because this is the aesthetic that they wanted. And for the plausible rhetoric of these reasons still don't fully explain why the developers didn't just implement modern designs into the environments, I think that they clearly did implement modern aesthetics into the environments, at least as much as they could. You can see these modern aesthetics throughout the countless instances of graffiti across mountains, or through the DJ and breakdance stadium in the Children of Echoes. To want both playable characters and the nation to have the same exact level of modern aesthetics was just not going to happen though, because to do so you'd have to make the entire environment futuristic to accommodate for the Natlan playable characters' futuristic technology, which, as I already explained, that just wouldn't make sense relative to the other major themes of Natlan. Now technically, these reasons still have some lore behind them, but again, I don't know what people expected. To expect the devs to fully rewrite the major themes of Natlan, aka Natlan as a whole pretty much, just so that we didn't get any modern aesthetics in Genshin Impact, even though they clearly wanted them to implement it, and even after I already explained how their implementation actually makes sense and has a ton of complexity, contrast, and appeal, I feel like at a certain point, the reason for why somebody wouldn't want modern aesthetics in Genshin Impact is simply because they just don't want modern aesthetics in Genshin Impact. In which case, for the next rhetoric of modern aesthetics don't fit into Genshin Impact, it seems to me like the majority of people who bring up this argument always give the same reason, that being that Genshin Impact has known to have medieval aesthetics like with Mondstadt, or magical and fantasy-like aesthetics that can be seen throughout every nation, and even futuristic-like aesthetics with the Fatui and Notcry, which is why modern aesthetics being introduced into a game that don't fit into any of these aesthetics that have been used prior is inherently bad, which is just flat out wrong. If it's not your cup of tea, sure, unpopular personal opinion, Mondstadt's German aesthetics just aren't my cup of tea. The environment and the music, in my opinion, is pretty mediocre, but to say that they are wrong or objectively bad, in the same sense that people say that the modern aesthetics, which have plenty of lore, contrast, complexity, and appeal, are objectively wrong, not because its implementation was wrong, but simply because the aesthetic itself is wrong, is just wrong. Just because it's never been done before doesn't mean that it's inherently wrong. By that logic, every nation's aesthetic is wrong, since every single one of them is so distinct from one another. Even to say that the modern aesthetic is wrong because it doesn't have any fantasy aesthetics either, which every nation prior to Natlan had, and is a major aesthetic in Genshin Impact, is objectively wrong, since Mavuika's bike is obviously made out of the ancient dragon tech, which definitely makes her bike look different, even if the contour of the bike still resembles that of a modern motorcycle. Not to mention, it has a dragon head and dragon wings. Not only that, but Kinich, although he does have 8-bit projections, Kinich has an actual ancient dragon in the form of that 8-bit projection. And again, Chaska's gun and Mavuika's motorcycle can both fly, with Mavuika's motorcycle being able to climb on walls and ride on water, which to me feels pretty fantasy-like. Point is, no, just because Genshin Impact hasn't introduced modern aesthetics into the game yet, it doesn't mean that the modern aesthetics are inherently bad. If you don't enjoy them, well then that's fine, but it is just an opinion. So, to prematurely answer the question that is the title, yeah, Natlan's modern theme was definitely done right, to the point to where it had as much, if not more substance than other aesthetics in the game. So, now that that's been answered, I wanted to cover the last rhetoric of why does only Xilonen know how to make the futuristic technology, almost as a little bonus, since I don't really think that this takes or adds to the answer of this video. Regardless, in my opinion, although it hasn't been flat out stated, it seems to me like either Xilonen's mentor, Tlasoli, or Xilonen herself were given crucial information by the previous holder of their ancient name. For context, ancient names can actually give you memories of their previous name holders, which can be seen when we saw Mualani remember everything that happened to Tupac. Thus, it makes me think that either Tlasoli or Xilonen learned something that, combined with their own high intellect, helped them figure out how to effectively use phlogiston, which is yet another reason for why only NPCs only have a decent amount of phlogiston technology in comparison to the playable characters who have their technology exclusively designed by Xilonen. Not to mention that the children of Echoes are known to be talented artisans. Anyways, to recap the rebuttals and rhetorics of this video, NPCs don't have futuristic technology because if they did, so would the environment. And if the environment did, that would not only ruin the tribal aspect of Natlan completely, which is important for emphasizing the history components of two major Natlan themes, but it also wouldn't make sense because Natlanese people would rather preserve their bonds with the Saurians, which they value as much as other human beings, than to exploit them and the environments for technological advancements. Not only that, but the only reason only playable characters have futuristic technology is so that there is an emphasis on that history component found in two major Natlan themes, and because only Xilonen, who was friends with the playable characters, knows how to make it. Lastly, the only reason the developers didn't completely rewrite Natlan so that modern aesthetics wouldn't be in Natlan, or so that Natlan could be completely futuristic, is because they simply didn't want to, which is fine because the modern aesthetic is simply a preference which holds depth, complexity, and appeal as good, if not even better, than other aesthetics. So, with the critiques out the way, yes, Natlan's modern theme was in fact implemented right, since this theme is a crucial aspect of every single other one of Natlan's themes, which tie into the dragon lore of Genshin Impact, which is a crucial aspect of Genshin Impact lore. Regardless, if you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. If you have any opinions, please leave them down in the comments below. I would greatly appreciate it. Goodbye.